Hello, everyone. I am Alexa Padilla, the content director for the symposium, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Asim Khwaja. Dr. Khwaja is a director for international development and the Sumitomo Foundation for Advanced Studies and the International Development Professor of International Finance and Development Center at the Harvard Kennedy School of Harvard University and co-founder of the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan. His areas of interest include economic development, finance, education, political economy, institutions, and contract theory/mechanism designs. His articles have been published in many media outlets, such as The Economist, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The International Herald Tribune, BBC, and CNN. Dr. Khwaja received bachelor's degrees in economics and in mathematics with a computer science degree from MIT and a PhD in economics from Harvard. He was born in London and lived in Kano, Nigeria, and Lahore, Pakistan, before moving to Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the United States. There will be some time for questions and answers at the end of his conference. In the meantime, feel free to ask your questions during the conference. And now, Dr. Asim Khwaja will be talking about education in developing countries.
Great. Thank you so much, Alexa. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be invited, and I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts, but then also really looking forward to questions from the audience. I should start by a caveat. I'm by no means an expert in Latin America. I have lots of fabulous colleagues who clearly work in the area, both in Latin America, but also in Mexico and Colombia. And so I have some sense, and I'm happy to answer some questions on that line, but I'm really drawing expertise from sort of global education, but also using Pakistan, a country where I do a lot of work in, as a case study, as an example of some of the global trends we see, but also as an example of the kind of work that I think we can do to improve education policy in emerging economies. So I thought what I'd do is let me start off by kind of talking a bit about where I'm coming from. So a very brief introduction to myself. Alexa was very generous in how she introduced me, but I'll talk a bit about the work I do. And then the Center for International Development, which I direct, a bit about our approach. And then I really want to jump straight into kind of the topic of the day, which is taking a learning systems approach towards education. And in doing so, I'm going to tie a bit to one of your previous speakers. I think Professor Claudio Ferraz talked about, from UBC, talked a bit about evidence-based policy. And that's something which I'm very supportive of as well. And a lot of the work that I'll mention very much draws on evidence-based decision-making. So I want to link a bit to what he talked about as a general example. And obviously, Latin America has been a place where there's been some tremendous amount of work. In the Mexican context, obviously, programs like Progresa or Oportunidades and sort of other conditional cash transfer programs have, within education, taken a fairly scientific or experimental approach. And I'm happy to talk a bit about that as well. Alexa, I assume you'll be able to see my slides as I'm moving forward with them. I'll take that as a yes, Alexa. Okay. As long as you're able to view the slides as I'm moving with them. So just a bit about my own research. So I work on three broad areas, and I'll talk a bit about the first kind of circle that you see on the screen, human capital, education in particular. But I do a lot of work also, and I'm happy to entertain questions on those later on from students and colleagues and audience members on sort of institutions, beliefs, social capital, how they influence things. And also, I do a lot of work on finance. And so if there are questions there, I'm happy to answer those as well. I also do, obviously, teaching. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is, again, this is something that was also mentioned by Claudio, this kind of policy cycle or evidence-based cycle. And so one of the things we teach is how do we adapt a framework, and this is the framework that is used in one of the research groups at CID, the sort of smart policy design framework, but the idea that you should use evidence in each of these stages, identifying problems, diagnosing issues, designing solutions, implementing, testing, and then refining them. And so this is something a critical part. And then personally, I enjoy doing a lot of institution building. And so I direct the Center for International Development. And previously, I was in the leadership of something called the Evidence for Policy Design, which is a sub-program in that. But I also enjoy creating organizations in developing countries, like a research center in Pakistan and a startup which was lending money, was very active in Latin America, was lending money to individuals using psychometric screening tests. And again, these are areas which I'm happy to talk about. A bit about CID as well, because I think that's pertinent to how we're working. So CID, the center that I now direct, and which Professor Ricardo Hausman used to direct before. I was very active in Latin America as well. But this center really draws on Harvard's expertise and faculty to really solve some of the most pressing development problems that the world faces right now. And I want to emphasize this approach because that's the approach I will demonstrate in my talk today, which is very much, as academics and researchers, as much as we bring in the rigor of our toolkit, analytics to the table, it's very important that we realize that the place where we should start from is very much the world of practice and the world of policy, which is focusing on problems which are really first order problems in the world, in the developing world, in the emerging economies, and start from that point and then use our tools as a way of addressing them. And this is the approach I want to be highlighting today as well, but I wanted to also shout out to it before I began. And I would say, one of the fundamental ways that I think we succeed in solving the development problem is really by talent. I mean, people talk a lot about various resource constraints like money or natural resources. For me, I think one of the most critical resource constraints is always basically people, talent. And that's why I'm interested in working in education, because that's one way of identifying, developing, nurturing, and deploying talent. And that's very much what CID does, it's very much what Harvard does, and it's very much, I think, what good, healthy economies should be doing. At CID, we do these, we develop talent by teaching. That's one of the big things we do, as any university does. We conduct research, and this is, you can think of conducting research like deploying talent in partnership with people in the world of practice and people in academic institutions around the world. And then you should convene talent, bring people together. I mean, we're in a virtual world. The conference that we're having right now is an indication of trying to convene a bunch of people in the world so we can share our learnings with each other. So with that, let me jump straight in now to education. And I want to highlight broadly, while I'll talk about some specific studies, and again, in the Q&A, I'm happy to go into a lot more details if people have questions about specific papers or specific studies, but that's not the idea for today, at least at the broader talk. It's meant to give you an overview of an approach. And I will argue that this approach is an approach which definitely has merit in education, but can also be used in any social policy, any policy reform, this kind of learning systems approach towards both policy making, evidence-based policy making in the way Claudio had alluded to, but also I would argue research. And so I'm going to do two things today. Really, these are my two goals. One is I want to share with you some of the work that is being done in education that I've been very involved in. And I'm going to use Pakistan as an example of this work. I've spent now with colleagues of mine over about two decades, or actually 2.5 decades now, just working on education. And it'll give you I'm going to give you sort of a summary as much as I can for that period and the insights we've gleaned from that period. And then in doing so, I'm going to highlight a specific approach, a kind of a learning system approach in how we can empower actors to address problems. And in doing so, I want to highlight the importance of experimentation and the importance of iteration, kind of repeating things in these experiments as well. Okay. So that's the objective. So let me start with kind of the global education context. And this is true pretty much the world over. It's true as much in developed economies and emerging economies, in developing economies, and all of these problems are true. by and large, in the world, enrollments are increasing. There still is a problem. It's not that we've addressed this. There still is a goal, global goal for us to get everyone in school. But the trends are very encouraging over here. The trends are that people are improving on these margins. At the same time, there is a large increase, and this is true in a lot of countries, again, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, where there's a big increase of the private sector. So there is a large presence in education. And just to give you an example, almost a third of children at the primary school age are now enrolled in low-cost primary schools. So there's a lot of innovation and entrepreneurship happening in the educational sector. But, and here's a big issue, learning levels are stagnant. And that's just as true in the United States as it is in Pakistan, as it is in parts of Latin America, which is we seem to be plateauing out on quality of education. And I'm still taking a very limited view of this, which is things like test scores. But if you take a more expanded view, which includes sort of what we call non-cognitive or 21st century kind of skills, like grit or perseverance or teamwork, those things we're not even measuring systematically, but the things we're measuring systematically, we seem to not be able to deliver the quality that would lead to a more productive workforce, a more can contribute to society, to economy as well. Now, I'm going to draw in today's talk, as I mentioned, on this work, which has now been kind of 2 decades worth of work. And this study called LEAPS, it's Learning and Educational Achievement in Schools, is one of the most comprehensive educational data sets now that is out there. And for students who are interested, there are several rounds of these surveys that we've done available for students to work with as well, if you want to. And I should very clearly acknowledge this is joint work with Tahir Indarabi, who's at Pomona, and Jishnu Das, who was at the World Bank and has recently moved to Georgetown University. And this work is, for the last 15 years, following these set of communities in Pakistan. And in these communities, we've tracked the evolution of everything about education. Schools, households, teachers, students, parents. We've been consistently surveying them in a panel survey sense. And we've been testing students as well. So for instance, in our latest work that we've recently done, now been following children who we tested in 2003. And now these children are young adults entering the workforce. So we can track their lifetime outcomes, or not lifetime outcomes, but their early adult outcomes in terms of being on the labor market. But this data has given us a pretty interesting perspective. And in the course of these surveys, we've run several studies, different kind of studies, often using techniques like randomized controlled trials to understand the various issues in the educational system, at least in this environment. But from those, we're getting a fair bit of understanding about some of these issues which are showing up in other contexts as well. So let me give you kind of, if you take the Pakistan picture, and a lot of the things I'm showing you in the Pakistan picture actually will resonate with lots of other countries as well. But the Pakistan picture is what I said to you earlier. When you look at enrollment, the trends are pretty positive, actually. There is a significant increase over time. We've made lots of progress. And I think sometimes in development, while we worry about our problems, we should also acknowledge and take time to acknowledge some of the successes we have had in the field. And in terms of getting children in, it's been a relatively successful experience. Still lots of work to be done, but the trend is very encouraging. And this is the other thing I highlighted in this context, this rise of this new player, if you will, in the educational space, private schools. And typically in a lot of countries, when we first thought of the private sector, and a lot of us might still think that way, we think of the private sector as elite schools in urban areas meant for the rich. What's beginning to change in emerging economies the world over is you're beginning to see these private sector emerge, not just catering. If you take a country like Pakistan, it's not possible if you have 20 million children in these schools that they're catering to the rich. This country doesn't have that many rich. And so what's beginning to happen, and this graph alludes to it as well, you see what looks basically like exponential growth. There's a massive entry into private education. And these are schools which are opening up in small rural communities. And they're already up to almost 40% of education. If these trends continue, you can imagine that more than half of this sector education will be catered to by these private schools. And this is a very interesting phenomenon, partly because the private sector is a very market-based sector that has pros and cons to it as well. On the concern side, obviously, we think education should be a right for everyone. And so if these schools are charging fees, are they reducing access for the poor? But on the positive side, these schools are very responsive to people's demand conditions. So when you look at the behavior of these schools, it tells us something about what parents and children want in education. And that's going to be very interesting as we examine some of the results that I will be sharing with you today. But I want the second fact. So the first fact is enrollments are going up. Second fact is the educational system has a big presence of these private players coming in. And just to give you a sense, a picture often we say is worth 1,000 words. Here's just one image to give you a sense of what these markets look like. So this is a picture of a village, of a rural community in Pakistan. And you can see this is settled in a certain way where you can think of the downtown area, if you will. There are lots of clusters of houses, and then there are agrarian fields around these houses. And what I'm showing you in these blue and yellow circles is I'm showing you basically the existence of public government in yellow and private in blue. And something for people to think about as we go along, and I'm happy if you have responses to this. So let me pose a question to you, the audience, and afterwards this could be a little quiz in the middle of the lecture. I'm a teacher, so I'm obviously going to try and test people. But more seriously, it's a nice way for us to begin to exercise some of our analytical minds. And what I want to share with you is, what does this picture tell us about the educational marketplace? And so some of the facts you see are their schools, the government schools are outside the village, the private schools are in the village, and they're pretty close to each other. Just to give you an idea of how these distances are, so if you take the two closest blue circles, that's probably less than 1 minute walk. So they're right next to each other. So this tells us something, and the shopping carts you see are basically local grocery stores in this community. Okay? So I want to come back and say, when you look at this picture, what does this tell you about both the demand for education in these communities, and what does it tell you about the supply, and what does it tell you about the nature of competitive forces in the educational marketplace? So when you look at a picture like this, do you say, this is a place where parents care or don't care about education? Is this a place where schools are fiercely competing with each other, or there is weak competition? These are the kind of things that we can start thinking about just from a single picture like this. But there's always going to be a but. So what's the concern over here? The concern over here is when you look at learning quality, and this is true in many countries where we've had international tests as well, it's really depressing, actually. So to give you an idea, a child who's had maybe 4 or 5 years of schooling, if you started at kindergarten, by grade 3, most children are still not functionally literate or can do basic arithmetic. This is just giving you some numbers, right? So, at this age, and this is a child who's 8 or 9 years old, only a third of these children can do 2-digit subtraction. So 11 minus 7. Or 14 minus 11, right? Only a third of them can do it. In English, only 14% can read a simple sentence. And what is even more depressing is in the local language, so this would be equivalent in Spanish, let's say, in this case in Urdu or one of the local dialects, less than half of people can read a sentence, right? So this is a pretty strong indictment of what is going on, which is a big issue is this country, and I would argue the world, faces a learning crisis, right? We're not learning as well as we should be. So really, I would argue that the main question for global education, one of the biggest questions that we're all facing right now is how do we improve learning outcomes? And in particular, and this is an even harder question, how do we produce the kind of learning quality that will lead to people's lives actually improving, right? And that means not just getting better jobs, but it also means a better citizen, being more satisfied in terms of what you achieved in life. So how do we give that kind of education? And that's really the central question, I would argue, in this debate. Now, one approach that has been used quite often, and it's a very successful approach. I want to be clear when I speak, I'm not criticizing this approach, but I am going to present a complementary approach, an approach which I think works well with this kind of approach. But let me give the first approach. The approach that we have used a fair bit is what I would call input augmentation. And here's how this works. You look at a particular education system, a school, and you might say, what do I think is wrong with this school? You might say, well, I don't think the textbooks are very good, or I don't think the teachers are very good, or I don't think it has the right technology in it. And what I do is I provide this input. So I go in as a government, as a researcher, and I add this input. That's why it's called input augmentation, right? And so I add this input, or I increase this input, and then I see how well the school is doing. Does it improve things? And if it's working, I scale it up. Okay? So it seems like it's a very powerful approach in many ways, because you're very determinate. You pick something. And a lot of education ministries and departments do this. We decide that our schooling system needs X, whatever that X may be. And then we give everyone X. Now, if we're good, we will actually do it in a scientific way. We'll try it out. We'll do a pilot on X. So that we can kind of work in that way as well. If we're not so good, then we might do it in an unscientific way. And so that's something we'll talk a bit about how that works. But one challenge in this approach is, which input should we pick? Okay, if I get the wrong X, am I going to be as successful or not? So that's one question. The second is, what if the input we pick changes from place to place? What if one part needs a different input? One region in my country needs one input and the other needs a different input. Can I be flexible enough? Can I find out about that? So these are two challenges in an approach like this. Okay. What's an alternative approach? And this is the approach that I'm going to argue for today. The alternative approach is what we would call a learning systems approach. In this approach, you arrive at the problem in a different way. You don't pick an input. Instead, you think of frictions in the system. You look at the entire educational system and you ask yourself, what are the frictions in the system? And you try and address these frictions through empirical methods, through experimentation and testing. Let me explain that. I'll make this a bit more clear. So let's think of education. Within education, we can think of the following actors. Sorry, I'm just going to switch my devices because I think I'm running out of battery. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to switch my input devices.
I assume you guys can still hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. Okay. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach. And this approach is going to start by asking the following questions. Whatever space you're in, let's say it's education, start by asking yourself, who are the relevant actors in this space? Okay, so let's do that. So first of all, obviously, parents and students. It's got to be that these are important actors in this space. Okay. Second, teachers. Pretty important. But it's not enough. As you start listing these actors, you realize, well, schools as well. Teachers are different from schools. So public and private schools, as I mentioned, that's another actor. But you don't stop over here. You realize there's many other actors who are involved in education. There's also education system intermediaries. So these are people who produce textbooks, who produce teaching material, who undertake teacher training. So these are going to be very important in the education system. And each of these actors, to succeed, need to be engaging with each other, right? Parents and teachers need to be able to interact with each other. Teachers and education system intermediaries need to interact with each other. Teachers need to be in schools. Parents need to be in, children need to be engaging with schools. So all of these interactions need to happen. And you can think of this, if you are doing Econ 101, you can think of this as a supply-demand framework. In any of these links, someone is supplying something with another person is buying, and vice versa. And if those links aren't going to work well, that'll create friction. So what's a friction? A friction is any one of these arrows, any one of these exchanges isn't happening properly. And in fact, one of the most fundamental problems, in fact, it's called the fundamental problem of exchange. One of the most basic problems in economics, or actually in any system, is exchange happening between agents the way they would like it to happen? No one's forcing over here. This is, if a student wants to learn from a teacher, is a teacher able to supply their teaching to the student, and is a student able to acquire it? If a teacher wants to be trained, is a teacher able to access training, and is a training provider able to provide it? If a school wants to hire a teacher, is a school able to hire a teacher, and is a teacher able to be to apply to an educational institution? These are all the kind of frictions. Now, anytime there is a friction, anytime this arrow gets broken, there is going to be a loss in productivity or a loss in desired outcomes. Now, this is the approach. Now, in this approach, what I'm beginning to do is I'm not picking an input. I'm not saying it's teachers or parents or students. I'm simply asking myself, who are the actors in the system? And I'm going to ask myself, are you able to interact between actors? Okay, so that's the question I'm going to ask. Now, what's the benefit of an approach like this approach where you're trying to find the little red X's in these arrows and you're going to try and remove the X's? That's the objective. So in contrast to the previous approach I gave you, we had to pick an input. You had to say, I think the problem is textbooks, or the problem is teachers. In this, you let the system tell you. You empower the actors to find out what's needed. Right? So imagine, the analogy is, imagine if you were trying to do small and medium enterprise development. You were trying to grow firms in your economy. And you're the expert. You could either say, I know what the problem with the firm is. The firm doesn't have access to technology, so I'm just going to give technology. Or you could basically let the entrepreneurs decide. You could create a system where the entrepreneur, the person who's running the firm, tells you, I don't have access to technology. And some other entrepreneur might tell you something else. No, I have access to technology, but I don't have access to finance. And so we're letting the system, the actors, tell us what the problems is themselves. They tell us what the input needed is. It also allows this approach allows it to be individualized and context-free. So if you're reducing frictions for one actor, the friction may be different than another actor. Or by reducing the friction, you may allow the actors to choose what they want to do. Once the friction is gone, let's say if firms can access finance, one firm may choose to borrow more, the other firm may choose not to. Right? So you're not forcing an input on someone, you're basically saying you pick. The real question whenever someone gives you an approach and an idea is to ask them, does it work? What's the evidence? Right? When we come in and tell you evidence-based policy, and if we come in and make statements without any evidence, then we're contradicting ourselves. We're being hypocritical. And so the reason I'm arguing for this approach is actually the other way around, which is this 2 decades of work in Pakistan made us realize that actually this approach can work. In fact, it's quite effective in working. And that's why I'm now coming to you and saying, why don't we think about an approach like this, a learning systems approach? And so I'm going to give you just today 4 examples on where this approach works. And in each example, I'm going to give you a different friction that we tried as researchers to address. We removed that friction, and then we saw what happened. So if you look back to the image I gave you before, imagine I said, I think this blue arrow has a red cross in it. And I'm going to try and remove the X. And if this was truly a friction, which was affecting the marketplace, which was affecting the ecosystem, when I remove the X, I should see good things happening. If I don't see good things happening, that means this friction wasn't important. Okay? So that's the exercise I'm going to highlight. So let me give you, like I said, 4 examples of doing this. Each of these examples is a separate academic paper. Most of them are published. And so for those students who are interested, you're welcome to look at either my website, or you can just Google my name and you'll find it. Or you can just do LEAPS, LEAPS Pakistan or LEAPS Harvard, and you'll see a study with all these papers in it. So these are results from, so I'm saving you the pain. Most academic papers, and this is the dirty secret, most academic papers, even those which are 100 pages long, usually have one or two powerful insights. So I'm just going to share the insights with you, and then the details you can read as you read these papers. That's not a bad thing, by the way. I think those are powerful papers which have one or two powerful insights. And so that's what I'm hoping I can share with you in the interest of time. So the first paper tells you how important it is, at least in the Pakistani context, to have teachers. What it tells you is that there's a labor market constraint. There's a constraint of having locally available teachers, which is restricting education. And so what this study showed is, it was very interesting. We found that in villages where the government had set up high schools, secondary schools for girls, those are the villages where 15 or 20 years later, we have a private sector revolution going on. This increase I showed you in private schools, it's heavily driven by the availability of women who can teach. And what was interesting in this study was it wasn't boys' high schools. It wasn't girls' primary schools. It wasn't boys' primary schools. It was girls' high schools or girls' secondary schools which was doing this. And what this is telling you is there is limited mobility. Teachers cannot move across space. It's telling you two things. One, teachers are mostly women, which is true in our context. Second, it's telling you that women are restricted to move from place to place, given the context over here. So if a village gets lucky and has lots of educated women, that village will benefit by having better teachers in that community. And you might say, well, maybe this is true from conservative places. This won't be true in progressive places. You know, this was the same story, by the way, in the US in the 1800s, right? So a lot of countries have been through this story. In fact, so there's a silver lining over here. A lot of these stories are there because women who are very talented were restricted from occupations. And guess what? They went into teaching. And so a lot of economies go through this phase where they benefit from these women who are highly skilled, who are in teaching, right? And I'd like you to think about, in your context, do you have such teacher shortages? And if you do, then creating higher education institutions will jumpstart education in those localities as well. So it's something for us to think about. But this was a labor market friction. It's not easy to hire teachers, and that's the friction we reduced. The second friction is always knowledge. Information is a public good, right? How do we know? One of the biggest decisions you will make as parents, for those of you who are parents, is where do I send? Hopefully you won't be thinking, should I send my child to school or not? Most of the people in the world are no longer thinking that. Most of the people in the world, including the very poor, understand the importance of education. But the big decision they're thinking is, what's a good school? And how much money should I spend? Okay, so I know the school charges 5 times as much. Is it giving me quality that is worth it? And this is an information failure. If you don't know the quality of what you're buying, you will make poor decisions. And education is very much the same way. And there's some really good studies. Miguel Urquiola and his colleagues and Chris Nielsen recently has some really great work showing the importance of information problems in the Latin American context, in Chile, and a lot of other countries where you've had report cards or educational results. This can lead to really big changes in the educational marketplace. So the study we did in our context was, we had 100+ villages. In half the villages, we tested every single school, and we gave all the parents in those communities, in those villages, report cards. So we told them, this is the best school in terms of test scores, this is not doing so well. And what was really fascinating in that world is we saw that because of this, we increased competition between schools. So actually, learning improved in all the schools, except some schools which shut down. And what this is saying is, if the competition gets harder, if you're good, you will fight. And if you're not good, if you shouldn't have been producing education, you will decide you can't compete and you will shut down. And this is really important, by the way. It's very important that we have systems, education systems, firm systems, in any sector, systems which allow the best to succeed and those who are not so good to do something else. right? And this destruction is just as important as creation. Okay? There's some really good work by people like Chiang Tai-Shih and his co-authors, which show in emerging economies, one problem is bad firms don't die off. They keep surviving. And what this work is telling you is that's because of information problems. If you bring information in, you allow the good to improve and the bad to move out to something else. We also saw improvement in enrollment. And we also saw, and what was fascinating is while test scores went up, the fees school charge went down. So this is also a lesson, and sometimes we come in too heavy-handed a way. We might say, I think the private schools are charging a very high fee. And countries have done this, right? And they try and put limits on how much you can charge in terms of fees. That may not be the right solution. Sometimes it is. But often when you intervene in the market and you disrupt natural forces, you could create more damage. And what we're saying is we got the same desired result, which is lower the fees of schools, but not by forcing them to do it, but by simply making them compete more aggressively with each other. And that's true. Think about it. If you have people compete, you either will offer a better quality or you'll have to drop your price, right? But you have to offer a better deal to the customer. In this case, a better value for money for a parent who's sending their child to school. So that's another paper that showed this result. The third is another constraint. So the first constraint I showed you was labor market. Second was information. A third constraint is finance. If you don't have access to finance, particularly if you're a private sector school, you can't improve. And lots of countries do this, right? Whether it be a conditional cash transfer that we're giving to households to try and improve their condition, or it be priority sector lending programs. Pretty much any central bank or any development bank in any country has one time or the other picked a sector and said, this sector is important for us. Could be an agriculture sector, it could be industrial sector of some kind, it could be a service sector, it could be a sector which employs poor people, a sector in some poor area of my country, a sector which has marginalized communities in it. And we try and support this sector by giving money. And we ran this experiment where we basically decided we would come in and give pure cash grants to schools. And we would see what that does. Does that improve education or not? And what you find is fascinating. First of all, giving money is helpful, which tells you that there was a financial constraint. But what is really subtle about this, this result, and I want to highlight it a bit, is how you give money matters. And this is really important. When we give financing, a lot of financiers, we don't take this as much into account. We don't take the saturation or the density of support into account. Let me explain what I mean by that. When we gave money to only one school in the village, we did two different experiments. We had a control group which got nothing. In one set of villages, we only picked one school randomly and gave it money. In the other group, let's call it the second treatment, we gave every school money. And what we found was very different. Not just money helps, but when you only give one school money, that school adopts what you could call a market stealing strategy. All it does is it tries to get children from the other schools to come to its school. So what does it do? It builds a larger building, maybe it puts a few chairs in it. It doesn't improve quality. It improves capacity, because that's the easy thing to do. But when you give every school money, now the problem is not everyone can do the easy thing. If all of you try to put more chairs or create more capacity, well, you're competing with each other. You're not going to win each other's children. So you have to do something more. And that's exactly what we found. When we gave every school money, schools improved quality, right? So they didn't do market stealing, they did a market growing strategy. So these are two examples of how you give money in an educational system. So it's not just you reduce a friction, but the way you reduce a friction can have a huge impact. In the picture on the right side, where we give every school money, our money increases competition. In the picture on the left side, our money actually reduces competition because we give one school an unfair advantage compared to other schools. And I would argue, and we can happily come back to this in the Q&A, most of the way we give finance is more like the left picture. We pick one player, one type of player, and we support it. Instead of creating more competition through our money giving, we create more monopolies less competition through how we give money. Okay? And that's a separate entire discussion. I told you I do a lot of work on finance as well, and this is where education and finance meet. But I'm happy to discuss this later on as well. But the point of this bigger study is if you reduce the financial friction, you can actually create good things from happening. We also are currently undergoing a study where we're giving schools access to knowledge. And this is work in progress. We're beginning to see if we can reduce the knowledge friction. So where do you buy? If you're a school or if you're a teacher, how do you know how to improve yourself? Where should you get teacher training from? Where should you get technology from? Anytime you want to innovate, is there a marketplace which sells you the stuff you need? And how do you know that's good or not good? And so we're trying to solve that problem as well. I wanted to kind of end with a few last thoughts, and then I'd love to hear from all of you where we're headed. And this is very pertinent to COVID right now. What we'd love to be able to do is to create a integrated hub of all things education, an educational marketplace. So go back to the picture I told you about schools and parents and teachers, and in this case, I added banks to it, and I added suppliers, I added private tutors to it. And then there's a bunch of us who float around in this space. I put the academics, I was being cheeky, I put us on top. We're not on top by any means, but in one circle is researchers. They're philanthropists, people who have done well and want to help. There's policymakers, leaders in countries who are deciding policy. And then there's external donors, the World Bank, the UN, UNESCO. How do we create a space where all of these actors can come together and support each other? And so obviously this is what I'm describing to you is an online marketplace, a platform. Technology has done a beautiful job of doing so. Imagine now buying online. It's trivial to be able to buy. I've effectively stopped going to shops. I go online, and whether it's an Amazon or something of the like, I'm able to get what I want, and I have reviews and I have ratings. So where we're headed towards, at least in Pakistan, we're beginning to create something which would look like this. It's not easy to do, but we're trying to work towards an integrated platform. And I would argue COVID, there's lots of terrible things about this year. But one of the things this year has done is it's forced us all, think of how you guys are listening to me. In a normal world, this wouldn't be happening. In 2019, which doesn't sound that long ago, because it isn't. In 2019, I would be physically there, or maybe I wouldn't have made it, because I would have said, gosh, I don't know if I can make it all the way to Mexico to give one talk. I'm happily sitting in my home office giving you a talk. You're happily listening in your respective areas. This connectivity is an opportunity for us to reimagine education and reimagine how we connect and how we reduce these frictions. And it's something I'd love to come back to again if there was questions around this, to say, what is the opportunity, not the loss? What is the opportunity that COVID presents to us in terms of improving not just education systems, but other systems going forward? So let me end with bringing everything that I said together. What am I really saying? What's the bigger point I'm making, which is beyond education, actually beyond even research? It's kind of more towards a policy approach on how we'd address systemic problems that we'll be facing. And I'm just saying two very simple things, okay? I'm saying, look, even if you have the right ingredients of success, often when we focused on the development process, we've talked about the lack of money, the lack of talent, the lack of entrepreneurs, the lack of ideas. And even if we had all of those things, right? What I'm arguing is there is still a problem remain, which is this problem of frictions, this problem of not having actors be able to work with each other. Okay. So what should we be doing? All we need to be doing is taking two critical sort of analytical steps. One, we should be empowering actors. And that requires, first of all, recognizing who the actors are. Half the time, we don't recognize people, right? A lot of the work we started doing in Pakistan on private schools was because private schools or entrepreneurs were usually small people in villages running small schools, and they were not part of the educational debate because they're too small to be recognized. They don't show up in the capital city. They don't show up in the rich circles, right? So our first job is to recognize, identify who are the relevant actors in the space that we're looking for, whether it's education or health or industrial policy, whatever you want. Who are the relevant actors who are operating in this space? And then enable them, empower them to act. And the second part, which I didn't focus on as a lot because I took advantage of Claudio's previous talk to you, is the idea of the 2019 Nobel Prize, Esther, Abhijit, and Michael, which is the idea of experimentation. And this is very important because the first part is, you can think of it almost as theory. Who are the people? How do we connect them? What are the frictions? But you can never be so arrogant as to think that your theory is always right. The theory is just a starting point. It's a story you tell about the world. You want to make sure you test all your stories. Not just test your stories, you want to have the modesty to realize a lot of these stories will not be right. That's not a big problem. That's not an indictment. That's not like you're terribly dumb. That's just life. And so what you need to create is an ability to experiment and to have an experimental, safe environment. What does it mean? That means an environment where you can fail. It's okay to fail. It's not okay to keep failing, but it's okay to fail. If you create an environment where failure is never accepted, guess what? Failure will happen. You just won't hear about it because it'll be hidden. And there's nothing worse than a hidden failure, because a hidden failure you never learn from. You never improve yourself. And so when I say experimentation, empower and experiment, I'm saying create a space where people can iterate, make mistakes. Everyone knows the mistake. They try and study why the mistake happened so they don't make the same mistake again. I can't tell you how many countries that I've worked in and policymakers I've advised are making the same mistakes that the previous government did because no one wanted to acknowledge the mistake, so they hid it. So they never learned from each other. So I will end with these two questions back to you, which is, are you, in whatever space you're in, you may be in education like I am, or you may not be, whatever area you're working in, whether you're an academic or you're a policymaker or you're just a citizen, are you enabling actors? That's the first question. And second, are you setting up an experimental, a learning approach where you're allowing people to test ideas out and to succeed and fail and learn from their failures? So I will end with this, and then I'm happy to take questions. Alexa, should I stop screen sharing? Is that, or should I keep my screen on in case people want to refer to stuff? I'm happy doing whatever you say.
You can keep it on just in case I want you to refer to something. So we will.
Actually, I can't hear you, Alexa.
Can you hear me?
Speak again.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We will be moving on to the questions made by the audience. So the first question was asked by Alondra Huerta, who asks, what do you think is the impact of the initiatives of private institutions that have on the economic development of a country?
Great question. It's a very broad question. So you have to realize when you ask an economist a question like that, you're never going to get a straight answer. You're going to get, on the one hand, this, and the other hand, that. Look, let me be very clear. If there's any actor in your economy, whether it's private or nonprofit or public, and you're ignoring the actor, you have lost GDP right there, right? You have taken an asset in your economy and you're not deploying the asset. So that's the first, that's a bold, perhaps obvious, but at least a strong statement I'm making. You have to enable actors. Now, some actors may be destructive. I'm not saying every actor is great. A terrorist is an actor as well. A criminal lord is an actor as well. But at least you start, I've always taken an approach in life that you start by empowering actors. Don't start with the assumption that I need to block people. Start with the default being that I need to unblock people, and then see what happens. And as it turns out, some fraction, and my view is it's always a small minority of those actors will be destructive. And then those actors need to be regulated. Those actors need to be checked. In an ideal world, those actors need to be convinced to be less disruptive, to be actually constructive. So the private actor, depending on what your view is and where you are coming from and who's the politician currently running, the private sector has often been one of those actors which are either embraced or maligned. And for me, that's too blunt a view of the world. And so for me, yes, they can be a huge engine of growth, provided we enable them, provided we enable not just any private actor. Often when we enable private actors, we enable the very big private actors. sectors, not the small ones. And so you have to have a level playing field. As long as you're doing that, my general sense is that they can be a really powerful force for change. That's very much true what we've seen in education, at least in the context that I have studied. It's very much true in other sectors as well. Alexa.
Thank you. The next question is made by Cecilia Trevino, and she asks, which initiatives can be provided to avoid school dropout at an early age according to the needs of each community?
It's a great question. So this can become a big issue. And in some countries, dropout can be very age-specific. In other countries, it's gender-specific. For instance, in our context, it's very common that a lot of girls don't continue into secondary school education. What you have to figure out when you look at things like these is, again, you can have conditional cash transfers, and countries have done that. And for those of you not familiar with TCTs, most of my Latin American colleagues will be, given the success of, like I said, programs like Oportunidades, or, you know, this Bolsa Familia, there's some great conditional cash transfer programs in Latin America. There is one concern with those programs, which is you're essentially bribing people to do what should be in their self-interest to do. So you have to ask yourself, why is it that a parent will not want to send their child to school? What's causing that dropout? Is it the parent's decision? Is it the child's decision? And I think it's critical, no matter what solution we come up with, that we first ask that question. Again, come back to my framework, empower the actor. Okay? And you may find out that the problem is not one of money. So what is a conditional cash transfer doing? It's thinking the kid must be working, and so the parent has to send the kid to school, to work, and that's why they're not sending them to school, so let's pay them to go to school. By the way, if that's the concern, you could just give an unconditional transfer. You can just make the parent slightly richer, right? But it could be that the parent is saying the kind of education I'm getting is not helping my child. And if that's the case, the right solution is not, in fact, the CCT's Progressa in that case may exactly be the wrong solution. Because guess what you do? If you send everyone to school and overcrowd schools and don't improve the quality in schools, you may actually worsen learning outcomes, in which case you've forced a parent to do something which is not worth them or their child's time to do. That's really bad, right? So we have to figure out if they are quality, and this comes back to the biggest question I asked in the beginning, which is, if we focus on quality education, and if education is worthwhile, I have yet to meet the parent who doesn't want their child to succeed. Very few parents are like that, right? That shouldn't be the assumption we make, right? Those are bizarre parents. Most parents want the best possible for their children. So if we give those parents the ability to see that this education will improve my child's livelihood, which is a quality question, we can actually stop a lot of these dropout problems. There's some really good work. If you look at work like Mushfiq Mubarak has some really nice papers in Bangladesh, where he looks at, so does Rob Jensen, two people. Rob Jensen has done really nice work in Dominican Republic and also in India, and Mushfiq has work in Bangladesh, where they show that when returns to education are going up, right? Because in the case of Bangladesh, a textile firm gets set up to employ women. In the case of Dominican Republic and Rob's work, he tells students the returns to education. There's also work that I think Chris and other co-authors are doing in Chile on this as well. When you look at studies like that, they're telling you that when you allow parents to understand the value of education, or the labor market changes in a way that education is valued. Rob has also worked on call centers in India and what they did to education. You will see improvements in enrollment. You will see reduction in dropout rates, right? And so that's the approach I always take, that there's something the parent is telling you which is not right about education. And by the way, for older kids, this could also be something different. With older kids, the kid has their own agency. They may find the school miserable. They may find the school a terrible experience. You get beaten up, you get insulted, you get made fun of. Why should you go? Right? And so we need to make those educational institutions attractive for those adult children who may otherwise be dropping out. And sometimes that might be that you need to rethink education. And if someone doesn't like math or learning Spanish, but they're really good at woodwork, or they're really good at some vocational skill, why not allow that to be offered in a way that it's dignified, in a way that it leads to a better job outcome for them? Alexa?
Thank you. Dana asks, what can be the impact of COVID-19 restrictions in education, especially taking into account that some students in developing countries don't have full access to technology and therefore online school? And what things are being done in developing countries in order to give students access to online education? Or what would you suggest?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you, Dana. It's a great question. So let me start by saying, before we start feeling sorry for developing countries, look, my kids are in the US. We're probably in one of the best schooling districts in at least my town. And gosh, we're having troubles as well, right? So a lot of the concerns we have about figuring out how to do online education are true the world over. And obviously, I don't want to diminish the problems that a poor country faces. If you don't have internet, there's no bandwidth, there's no connectivity, there's going to be no online education, right? But let me answer your question in a slightly different way. And I'll come back to then your specific wording as well. I want us to ask a question which is not a defensive question. A lot of the educational debate, and this is true in rich countries and poor countries, it's a mindset, we have a very defensive mindset. Our mindset has been, how can we possibly get back to the way we were teaching before? So everything we're trying to do in terms of our interventions, online education, different types of learning, is all trying to replicate something that was before. Well, what we had before wasn't terribly good, right? So the question I want to pose to all of us in education is not try and go back to where you were, but given where you are, reimagine what you can do. Okay, so can we teach in a different way, right? And as you start asking that, you can start asking yourself to say, what are the resources I have available, okay, to teach? So let me give you one or two examples. Now, first of all, you're right about bandwidth. But what is amazing, and we're seeing this in developing countries, is, look, you look at mobile phone penetration. It's astounding, right? Even the poorest of the poor will have some kind of phone. It may not be the smartest of smartphones. It may be a really cheap phone. It may not even be a smartphone. It may be a feature phone, but they are conducting business on that phone, right? They're able to say, give me a little missed call if I don't have to pay, or ping me on this and I'll show up over here. So we have to say, take the devices we have and the technology we have as given, start from there, make investments in it as well. I think this is a chance for us to do massive investments in broadband. Like I said, the physical cost of the devices is low. We need to lay networks, towers, subsidize heavily broadband expansion. Think of broadband like making roads. We decided at some stage in our development process that every place needed to be connected by a road of some kind or a rail track of some kind. Think of broadband in exactly the same way. So provide it, make it really easy. Second, once you have this technology there, start reimagining how you can teach. What did I tell you one of the biggest constraints of teaching was? Access to teachers, the matching problem. If you have someone in some small village somewhere, let's say, I don't know, you're in Chiapas or some area there, and you have some amazing teacher who's in Mexico City, who typically wouldn't be able to teach because he or she is really occupied with life. There's so much labor. Just take all of you in the audience right now. Each one of you can easily teach children if you wanted to. But we make it so hard because our normal teaching process is someone has to show 9 to 3, show up in a school, get this certification, get that certification. You have an ability to deploy lots of teaching talent to teach individuals in a one-on-one way. In fact, I would argue, what's the holy grail? The biggest thing in education for us. The biggest thing in education for us is what we call a personalized educational journey. This is what good parents do. Each of our children have different learning obstacles. We spend time with the child and we say, this child learns if you encourage them. You have to constantly love them, otherwise they'll get discouraged. This kid needs a tougher education system. They need to be pushed a bit more. This kid gets really excited with math. This kid loves art. For every child, the way we developed education was actually that way. If you look at the history of education, when you look at things like the Socratic method of education, it was beautiful because we had one teacher and an apprentice, and there was this personalized relationship. The problem with that system was only a few people could get it. So when we scaled up education, we made like the Lay's potato chip of education. Everyone gets the same thing. It's cheap and everyone gets it. And what technology is going to allow us to do, in the same way that we're going to individualize drug therapies, so why should we all take 200 mg of Tylenol or whatever? We should be able to titrate to our actual needs. You can come up with a world where if we know each child learning obstacle through technology, we can deliver each child his or her own educational journey. And for me, COVID is a massive shock to our system, right? It's a huge shock in terms of health consequences, obviously, but I would argue it's a massive shock for us how to rethink education. And so my urging to a lot of my colleagues who work on education, particularly who are policy leads, is to not try and replicate the old, but recreate the new, right? And there, I think there's a lot of things you can do, even when you have low bandwidth, although I think that's a very solvable problem as well. Alexa.
The next question is made by Alondra, and she asks, does the concept of result cards only work during a specific time in the academic life of a person? And is Harvard passing or failing its students right now?
Oh, wow. Pretty direct questions. Let me answer this at multiple levels. First of all, look, information in general is a classic public good failure. When we define what a public good means in economics, one of the big examples of that is information. It's an excludable public good. It doesn't have to be, it's not like air. And the reason I mention that is often we fail in providing public goods. And so the idea that we should be moving towards systems which allow people to choose what's good or bad by labeling things as good or bad is fundamentally important. The debate is not that. The debate is, how do you measure what's good? And that's a good debate to have. But I don't want that debate. In the US context, we talk about policies like school accountability and teacher accountability, and people get worried to say when you start having accountability systems, you start teaching to the test. So if you're going to reward schools for how well they do on math, everyone's going to be teaching math, and people are not going to teach something you're not testing on, like creativity or human values, right? But that doesn't, the response to that should not be, let's take away accountability mechanisms or let's take away report cards. The response should be, let's improve our report cards so we allow parents a wider sense of different outcomes. So that's the first statement I want to make. The second statement, which is, which was more specific to places like Harvard, should you stop testing? Look, in a situation where people are in distress and these things are creating stress, of course you can diminish these things, right? You can make things less high stakes. So for instance, a lot of colleges have decided this year not to use SAT as an admissions criteria because it's too hard for people to take those things. But let's not be naive. If you take away one signal of quality, schools will still have to pick. It's not that they're going to admit everyone. And so the danger when you get rid of one accountability system is it'll be replaced by another system, which may be much worse, which may be more unfair, which may be more biased. Look, I came from a developing country into the US, and frankly, the only way I got in here is I took a standardized test, because that was the only way I could demonstrate performance in a global audience. So yes, I'm a big fan of testing and accountability systems, but at the same time, I recognize that you need to have flexibility in these systems. They can't become rigid. And you need to have the ability in times of distress and shock to be able to replace them with softer systems. But the idea of these things is critical.
Thank you. Our last question is, what is your opinion about the role of social media in education? And how can we make algorithms in social media be beneficial for students instead of a distraction?
That's a great question. Thank you again. Look, a lot of academics, we spend a lot of time, in fact, not just academics, many others spend a lot of time getting upset about social media. My cynical view is because none of us have a media presence. The most popular of us probably has like 1 million followers compared to someone who's putting cat videos on YouTube or pictures on Instagram who probably has 50 million followers. So we don't understand social media, right? We don't understand how to leverage it, and policymakers are the same way, right? That said, if you look at the facts, what are the facts? The facts are a lot of people, especially younger people, engage heavily with each other with the world through this medium. That's the fact. These just numbers don't lie. The other fact is there are lots of people who are massive influencers, right? People who have following of 100 million. And these aren't necessarily, sure, the celebrities do, right? The big musicians, the big sports stars, the big movie stars, they all have massive followings. But there are other individuals who were just a nobody 2 years ago and somehow have a massive following. And one interesting question for us is, and we know this from a lot of research, that in any information system, in any learning system, in any society, there are always people who are influencers. They could have been the learned, they could have been the elders, they could have been the leaders, they could have been the rich. It's always been the case, and there's a lot of interesting work on network theory as well. There's some really phenomenal work being done in that area. It's clear that there are nodes who influence more than just any other node, right? They're mega nodes of influence. And we see that in social media now as well. So I think the real question for us is not, is a medium good or bad? Because media have always existed. We just have a new medium which we don't fully understand right now. It's to embrace that medium, take the same approach I said to you earlier. Who are the actors on this medium? What are they doing? What is the currency of excitement in this medium? And then take that as a given and start by saying, can I add to that? Can I leverage that resource to do something positive, to bring about some positive change? Now, it's easy enough for me to say this. This is not an easy thing to do, but we should start by embracing those individuals, not just because someone is posting cat videos or I painted my dog red today, let's experience that. Just because they've done that does not mean that they can't also become a vehicle for interesting content. And this is something we've thought about in my center and other places to say, can we work with individuals like that? Can we work with individuals who have somehow find themselves by accident or by strategy at a place where they're influencing others, where people are following them? Can we enable them to pass on powerful content, positive content? And that's a deeper question. We had a really fun conference a couple of weeks ago at CID, the GEM conference, where we talked about the role of social media in polarization. So we had colleagues of mine talking about, is one of the reasons populism is on the rise because of social media? Is social media a vehicle for negative? Is it always the case that the bad news will be shared, not the good news? Is it always the case that we make fun of someone and not celebrate someone? I don't think the psychology is such that that's an inherent feature of a medium. Now I'm making conjecture, so let me be careful over here. This is not an area I've studied. I have colleagues who've studied it, and so this is a lot of conjecture. But I don't necessarily see something inherent about media which do that. So for me, I still remain sanguine. I still remain somewhat optimistic that you can take these modern media that are coming up and start deploying them as forces of good. And you've seen examples of that. In COVID, there are places where media stars have come out and given positive messages: wear a mask, be careful. You've seen the opposite as well. Don't wear a mask, I'm not going to get sick. I won't mention, many leaders have done things like that. But you've also seen some really positive, powerful cases as well. In the education policy context, can you imagine a role where social media can start producing material which excite us? I'm not talking just the Khan Academies of the world. Those are great examples of teaching content. I'm talking about something even more basic than that, which is the biggest gift you can give to someone. And frankly, I got this gift when I was young enough, was a gift of curiosity. The gift of realizing that there's lots to discover about the world. It's a very interesting, exciting world. You should be curious about the world around you. And the gift of agency, which is you can take that curiosity and you can translate it into something you could do, maybe small, that could make a difference. If you just use media to inspire people in the way when I was a kid I was inspired, and many of you may have been, if you use these media as a way of building curiosity and celebrating agency, I actually think it would be a really powerful medium. I think you could inspire kids to want to go to school, to want to learn, to want to become the next Einstein, to want to become the next superstar, not just in an academic sense, but in any achievement sense, to become the next Messi, right? So I think there is a powerful way we can play. So I'll end with that. I mean, we are in a medium. I was able to reach you through a medium. I'm grateful for that medium. I think they are interesting, fascinating questions you guys have raised. And I'm hoping that in the years to come, those of you sitting in the audience will be the ones presenting and we'll be the ones hearing you in these ideas. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be with all of you. Alexa, thank you.
That is all for our questions today. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. It has been a pleasure learning from you. And we hope to count with your participation in any future events organized by the Economic Student Association. And we hope to see you in Monterey at one point. I want to remind everyone that we will be having our next conference at 6 p.m. by Pepe Villatoro. Thank you so much.